For the last century, hard work and reliability have always been essential if you want to be successful in the oil field. Today, you need real-time, actionable data that's just as reliable and hardworking as you. In order to see the full picture, you need energy intelligence that you can count on, because big moves don't make themselves. FracScape combines advanced satellite imagery, mobile GPS tracking, machine learning, and artificial intelligence to map the upstream supply chain in real time with pinpoint accuracy, crew by crew, truck by truck. Operators can avoid surprise frac hits, save money on crew costs, and benchmark performance. Oilfield services can hunt ducks, win more deals, and beat the competition. Financial analysts, you don't have to wait for earning calls to find out what companies' latest moves are. But don't wait. Work smarter. Work harder. Join the energy intelligence revolution. FracScape from Sourcewater.
Hi, I am Faiza Rizvi, Associate Editor with Hart Energy, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for a very unique webinar on how AI, satellite, and GPS are disrupting oilfield intelligence. We'll also talk about the big launch of FracScape, a new geospatial intelligence platform from Sourcewater that analyzes satellite imagery, mobile GPS, and regulatory big data. Joining us today is none other than Josh Adler, founding CEO of Sourcewater, technology leader in upstream energy and water intelligence, which he founded in 2014. Josh is a graduate of Yale and MIT and holds 11 patents related to image processing and geospatial data analytics. Josh previously served as an economic policy official for President George W. Bush and has founded medical device, internet, real estate, and robotics companies. That is a very impressive bio. Thank you, Josh, for being with us today. We look forward to a great discussion. Now, before we begin, I'd like to quickly go over some housekeeping notes. As a reminder, all attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them using the chat feature, and Josh will be more than happy to answer those during the Q&A session. Additionally, a recording of today's presentation will be shared after the webinar. So without further ado, let's begin our discussion, and I'd like to hand it over to Josh. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. And Faiza, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm Josh Adler, the founding CEO of Sourcewater in Houston, Texas. And I also want to thank Hart Energy for inviting us to present on this important topic today, fracs, ducks, and trucks, how artificial intelligence, satellites, and GPS are disrupting oil field intelligence. And I also want to say thanks to so many new people signing up for today's webinar. We had a lot of people sign up, so it seems like we're hitting a nerve with the topic. And we've got a lot of people who we've actually never met before, a lot of companies that we haven't heard of before. So I'm really excited about that. And because we have so many new people, before we get into the main webinar topic, I'd like to give a real short introduction to Sourcewater and what we do, so you know where we're coming from. Sourcewater, our mission is holistic energy intelligence. And I know the water in the name throws some people off. We started back better part of 10 years ago as the first water marketplace for upstream oil and gas. And over the decade, we've evolved into the leading water intelligence platform, and now into the technology leader in upstream energy and water intelligence. So our mission is to gather, analyze, and visualize omni-channel data in what we like to think of as the upstream energy industry's most advanced geospatial mapping platform to show energy and water activity on the surface and in the subsurface earlier, more completely, and more accurately than any other source. We've actually had 13 US patents granted over the last few years, and we've got more than 10 pending. So just quickly, what sets Sourcewater apart as an energy intelligence service is three things, I'd say. One is, if you think about the traditional conventional energy intelligence industry, you're really talking about the lower left corner of this graphic here. It's government records, right? For 60 years, energy intelligence companies scrape permit data from the Railroad Commission, and they chew it up to some extent or not, and they spit it on a map. And it comes on the internet now. It used to come on an 8-track or a CD-ROM or a floppy or a dial-up modem, however you got it. And we do that. We do that for oil and gas data, like some others do. And we also do it uniquely for water and disposal intelligence in ways that really no one else does. But we don't just do government regulatory data gathering and mapping. We get some data from our online water marketplace, price on water and disposal and logistics. We do geoscience analysis specifically for the geoscience of saltwater disposal and induced seismicity, and understanding where water can and should or does go in the subsurface. We gather internet data from over 1,000 local newspapers to be able to map drilling plans published publicly in advance of any drilling permit filings, which is required in a lot of states. And we have a patent on that. And then where we also differentiate ourselves, in addition to the breadth of our data sources, is in the advanced work we've been doing, really pioneering the use of satellite imagery analysis and mobile GPS data to understand real-time supply chain activity in the oil field. And this is stuff no one else has done before. In a little bit, I'm going to tell you about how and why we got into that. But this is also an area where we have a lot of our IP. And as I'll show you, we've had over 10 patents just in this space of analyzing satellite imagery and mobile data to understand real-time supply chain activity in the oil field. Now, before we get into the main topics, our product lineup today is not just water intelligence, but of course, as many of you know, because you joined us, a lot of new kinds of intelligence about upstream energy activity. So our products include WaterMap GIS, which is basically everything you'd expect from an online energy intelligence platform, oil and gas production curves, and land data, surface ownership, all the pipelines mapped, as well as powerful GIS tools in that data context, everything integrated into a single source. You can plan and share projects with your colleagues, contextualize them with market data. Our next product is WaterMap Pro, which is the industry's most advanced intelligence platform for mapping oil field water sources and movements and uses. And that platform is particularly known for the way that it maps the movements of produced water from every oil and gas producing lease in Texas and North Dakota to every commercial disposal lease month by month from asset to asset. Then there's WaterMap Geo, which is an exciting new addition to our lineup. WaterMap Geo is the first geoscience platform custom built for saltwater disposal and induced seismicity analytics. And so we invite the geologists and geophysicists out there to check it out. But really what we're going to be talking about today is two elements of our product line. One is Dirt Work Alert, which uses satellite imagery to detect well pads and frac pits to show drilling and completion plans before permits and rigs. And then we're going to be introducing a brand new product that no one has ever seen before, and that's the reason for this webinar, which is called FracScape. FracScape is near real-time pinpoint frac, rig, and DUC, or drilled but uncompleted well tracking and analytics. And you're going to see some really new stuff there that no one has ever seen before. So try to make it through this first part so you can see the cool things I'm going to show you toward the end. So now let's get on to the topic of the day, which is what is market intelligence and what are new technologies for market intelligence that we're applying to understand the upstream supply chain. So first, we're going to talk about what is market intelligence. We're going to talk about problems and opportunities in conventional or traditional energy market intelligence. Then I'm going to talk about some new technologies that have developed just over the last 5 to 10 years that have enabled completely new methods for intelligence gathering in the oil field. And then we'll get into our product, Dirt Work Alert, and how we detect and analyze well pads and frac ponds before permits and rigs. And then FracScape, where we'll talk about near real-time supply chain activity, including the ability to do daily pinpoint tracking on the same day of frac crews and rig crews, how you can use this for logistics optimization to save hours per day per field worker in the field. And then we'll show you some really cool stuff that no one has ever seen before for near real-time oil field truck tracking of water, sand, waste, and crude oil trucks. So first, let's talk about what is market intelligence. Fundamentally, market intelligence means knowing what other companies are doing in your markets. And there's a lot of different kinds of market intelligence. People use it for business development opportunities. So finding the right deals first, so you can get to them and win them before the competition. There's competitor activity. Are you winning or losing versus others? Where and why? You can look at asset performance, comparing your assets like your wells and your utilizations of your assets like disposals and pipelines. How do they compare to other companies, to your peers? You can do price and cost benchmarking. That's a form of intelligence. Are you paying too much for the services that you buy? You can look at supplier performance. Are your vendors the best in class, or other companies' vendors performing faster or better or with more reliability or safety than yours? And another that's become very, very popular recently for us is ESG ratings. How do your environmental impacts rank compared to other companies in your space? Are you emitting more or less methane relative to your amount of oil or gas production? Are you putting more miles on the road? Are you recycling more or less water or consuming more water? Are you at greater risk of induced seismicity than your competitors on your water disposal and fracturing activities? There's a lot of ways to look at environmental and social and governance rankings, and that is a big growing area of market intelligence. Now, there's a lot of use cases, and I've kind of touched on these, so I won't spend a lot of time on each one. But in terms of the kinds of companies that use market intelligence, from companies like Sourcewater, there's oilfield services, midstream, saltwater disposal, equipment, and commodity companies. They want to know where they can win more business from E&Ps ahead of or at an advantage to their competitors. They want to know where they can find assets that would benefit from their services, like if they're doing well cleanouts or optimizing disposal or artificial lift. And they want to know where they should buy or build new facilities to get the highest return on investment. These are all great use cases for our data. Another major market intel use case is for operators. And there's a lot of different departments in most big operators that can benefit from better market intelligence. Completions, drilling, production, logistics, procurement and supply chain, and even others. They want to know where and how they can save on oilfield services, on logistics, and on commodities, whether it's sand or chemicals or water. They want to know how to identify the best and worst performing assets and vendors in their portfolio. Who should they top grade and who should they take down or take out? They want to know how they can benchmark their cost and well productivity and services productivity and ESG performance versus their peers, particularly to attract the investment community today. And they want to know how they can avoid damage and liability from external events such as frac hits and earthquakes from induced seismicity. Another big user group for us is mineral investors. They've been very excited about Dirt Work Alert in particular, because it allows them to see where drilling and completions are going ahead of permits and rigs. Our SWD pre-permit alert also does that. It shows people where new disposals are going, even before the drilling permits for the disposals come out. And then the last category where we see a lot of use is from energy investors and analysts. So the kinds of questions they ask us include, how do I find, evaluate, and due diligence operator, oilfield service, and infrastructure deals? Not just believe what the guy selling it to him tells them, but actually find some independent way to measure that performance and judge that decision. They want to know how can they see and verify well inventory, cycle times, growth, and productivity ahead of the earnings calls so they can get a jump on the market. They want to know how they can independently quantify market share and performance of operators and oilfield service companies. Again, not just believing what comes out to the public, but really digging into it, maybe even ahead of those announcements. And some of them, particularly energy traders, want to know how to model upstream commodity supply and demand, not just the crude and gas, but the supply going in, like sand and rig availability and frac crew availability, earlier and more accurately. So now let's talk about conventional oilfield market intelligence and some of the shortcomings. So of course, the number one type of oilfield market intelligence, everyone knows it, is word of mouth, right? Or the Bubba net. So it's got some advantages. First of all, you can really get a deep understanding of what's going on from the few people that you know well enough who will really tell you what's going on. And so you might say the pro is that talk is cheap, right? You don't have to pay anything for it as long as you know somebody. Although in reality, you often are paying for it in the form of, drinks or tickets or trading favors, helping somebody out. The negative is that talk is cheap, right? You get what you pay for. And pretty much anybody who's telling you something that you didn't already know is telling you for some reason, right? Now, that reason might be that you've been friends for a long time, but that reason might be that they're talking up their own book or trash talking their competitors. There's a lot of that out there. And so it's hard to know what to believe unless you have some independent way of verifying it. The next major category of oil field intelligence is permits and regulatory data. And this has been going on for about 60 years. Arguably, it's been going on for about 160 years. And, everybody does it, right? You check the Railroad Commission website or the OCD, and you're going to get that data. And so there's lots of it, a lot of it. It's low cost because a lot of it is free from the government, although most people pay for services that clean that data up to some degree. And everybody does it, right? It's the context, it's the standard. You have to know what the regulatory data says to know what's going on out there because everyone else does it. The negative is that regulatory data often is late, it's often missing, it's often erroneous, and everyone does it. So there's no edge in it. You have to do it, but it doesn't really give you any net value. You just don't want to be left behind. The third kind of standard oil field market intelligence is rig tracking. And rig tracking has been going on for decades and decades. It used to go from phone calls to the rig contractors and then updating weekly. Now some companies put GPS trackers on the rigs. It's timely, it's accurate, but as we'll get into, the value today in the unconventional era is very limited because it's only a minority of spending today that goes on drilling activities. Most of it's spent on completions, and rigs don't really tell you anymore where the oil and gas is being produced. That's the fracs that tell you that. So rig tracking just doesn't do much for you today in the modern era. So regulatory data, it's the standard, but is it a gold standard or is it a rust standard? Well, one problem is regulatory data has always lagged, particularly spuds and completions in Texas, New Mexico, some other states are reported by Frac Focus and the Railroad Commission, typically 5 to 7, even 9 to 12 months after they happened, which isn't that useful for intelligence purposes. And production and injection data is reported even later. That can be 12 to 15 months after it happened. Also, regulatory data are often missing or incomplete. So for example, regulatory data doesn't tell you anything about the locations of well pads, frac ponds, frac crews, sand, water, lease roads. There's a lot of stuff that just doesn't get recorded. That wasn't the purpose of the regulation. And also a lot of that data is missing or incomplete. So for example, we've actually studied this, 47% of spuds reported by the Railroad Commission over the last 100 years have no date on the spud. You don't know when the well was drilled. 17%, almost 1 out of 5 of well bores in the Railroad Commission database have no location. So we know they exist, we know who owns them, but we don't know whose it is, where it is. Also, the data is sometimes just straight up wrong. Sometimes it's inaccurate by error, digits get mixed up, numbers get left out, or there's a decimal point that looks like a comma or a comma that looks like a decimal and it screws it all up. Sometimes the inaccuracies are by design because somebody's trying to throw off their competitors and plant a false flag, and no one really ever has a way to verify that or check it. And finally, with regulatory data, there's just no edge. Everyone has it. So ultimately, none of it matters that much if you're actually trying to grow or expand your business. Now, as far as late data, this is a great example of it. We were doing a study with the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology back in mid-2018, comparing some early satellite imagery analysis we were doing of frac ponds with the volumes of water reported as injected by Frac Focus. And everything was tracking really nicely, as you can see. And again, this was June 2018. When we saw that in the second half of 2017 into the first half of 2018, the volumes of water reported as injected in the Midland Basin by Frac Focus started falling off a cliff. And if this was 2015 and we were in the middle of the last crash, that would make sense. But in this case, we were in an up market. So why was the water crashing? And that was a really important eureka moment for us, because what we realized was, oh, it's because the Frac Focus completions data has a reporting lag that's a rolling lag that can be as much as 12 months late. And so you don't suddenly see it cut off. What you see is the numbers dwindling down until they finally get to zero, because it's a rolling reporting case. And you have no idea what's actually happening in the market over the past year. Whereas the satellite imagery was showing us what happened literally in the last 5 days, if not yesterday. And so it's extremely current and very accurate. Here's another example of regulatory data being inaccurate. The red dots that you're seeing in these maps are wellbore coordinates according to the Railroad Commission. Now, they didn't create these, they were reported by the operators. It's not the Railroad Commission's fault. Let me be clear about that, is that they don't have any way to check what's being reported. And what's being reported is wellbore locations that are not on well pads. So if you look at the zoomed in picture on the left, you see some red dots there. Those are some examples of, what are you going to believe? The regulatory data or your own lying eyes? So what are we seeing there? Well bores that are not on a well pad, right? So what's right, the image or the coordinates? And the reality is, if somebody rounds a third decimal digit on a GPS coordinate or it's missing, they can be off by something like 50 meters just from that one little mistake, much less having multiple digits missing or something reversed or a negative sign that puts you somewhere in the middle of China. So you need some independent way to check whether these are accurate. You can't just rely on the original source. And then another type of regulatory error that is incredibly common, and we get an earful about this every day in our business, is that there are just erroneous data in there. So this is an example of a single bad data point from monthly data running back 40 years for a single injection well. And at some point, somebody added 3 zeros on the end of a number where there shouldn't have been 3 zeros. And over 40 years, that threw off the average performance of that injection well by more than 20%, a single wrong data point in 40 years of monthly data. Well, there was a lot more wrong than, one per month over 40 years. What happened there? It was probably a ... that looked like a 000, or maybe it was a comma that looked like a dot, or somebody just, reversed some digits or got it wrong. Some people call this a fat fingers problem. Somebody comes in filling out the forms who isn't the regular person. You need all kinds of error checking systems to find this stuff, but there's a lot of erroneous data in there, not just missing or off. Now, last area of conventional market intelligence, let's talk about rig tracking. It's just not sufficient for the unconventional era. This chart comes from our friends at Infill Thinking, where they show that more than 90% of drilling today is horizontal drilling. In fact, it might be something more like 96% of wells are now unconventional wells. That's really accelerated over the last 10 years, so that today, knowing where a well is drilled or when it's being drilled just doesn't tell you very much about oil field spending. Because in unconventional or horizontal wells, the great majority of the spending, more than double the spending on the drilling, is the spending on the completion or the frac. And that's what uses the sand and the water and the disposal and the logistics. Most of the spending is on the frac today. And there's a lot of drilled but uncompleted wells out there. So just knowing that a well was drilled, it's necessary, but it's not remotely sufficient. You have to know where and when the completion is happening to really know where oilfield activity is happening. And understand, of course, most wells, the 96% that are unconventional, they don't produce any oil or gas until they're fracked. So knowing the well was drilled doesn't tell you anything about the energy market or the commodity market either. You have to track the fracks. And also, all oilfield intelligence is local in nature when you're trying to understand the market. So a lot of this broad data doesn't tell you very much about what's going on. In other words, if you look at this graphic that I'm running on the right here, what we've done is over the last year and a half, we analyzed completion locations every day, and we compared the trend within the local areas for completions to the overall trend in the market. And of course, everyone knows 2020 was the worst crash of all time for the overall market. But even in the worst parts of 2020, in April, May, June of last year, you had submarkets where actually the completions trend was up, not down. And in the big pickup we've had since the beginning of this year, there have been plenty of submarkets where the trend has been down, not up. So you have to have very, very localized, timely, spatio-temporal analysis to understand what's happening in energy markets. Now let's talk about new technologies that have arisen over the last 5 to 10 years that have made completely new kinds of market intelligence possible. And then we'll get into how we're applying these. So there's three main areas I want to touch on. One is the rise of cloud computing. A second is the rise of remote sensing, things like Internet of Things, satellite imagery monitoring, mobile location data tracking. And then the third one is the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning, which allows us to make sense and find patterns in vast amounts of data that no individual human or even team of humans are able to process on any kind of timely basis. So first, let's talk about the rise of cloud computing. So if you've heard of Moore's law, you know that this is the theory, which has proven true decade after decade, that the power of computing will double and the cost will halve about every 18 months. And this has resulted in a truly extraordinary exponential reduction in the cost of what is now cloud computing processing and the cost of storing incredible amounts of data. So if it weren't for Moore's law and the rise of cloud computing and services like AWS, we wouldn't be able to store and process the amounts of data that we're now able to gather. So we wouldn't be able to conduct the new kinds of market intelligence. And even just in the last 10 years, there's been this incredible exponential reduction in these costs. And we weren't able to do these things even 10 years ago. Then let's look at remote sensing. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of remote sensing, but basically it's what it sounds like, right? Seeing things at a distance. So one type of remote sensing is Internet of Things. There's now sensors everywhere, and this is going crazy because they cost pennies now, where they used to cost hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars if you think about SCADA systems from, say, 20 years ago. So there's now sensors everywhere, including on a lot of moving vehicles. And there's sensors like TextNet, seismic sensors everywhere, all kinds of ways of gathering information from vast areas at super low cost. Another form of remote sensing is satellites and global positioning systems. Look at this chart on the left. Look at that exponential rise of the number of satellites in orbit around the Earth just in the last 3 to 5 years. I mean, it's more than doubled in the last 3 to 5 years. The things that we do with satellite imagery intelligence, we couldn't do those even 5 years ago. And now there's satellites everywhere driving down the cost of this imagery. And there's all kinds of satellites too, detecting all kinds of things, which is pretty cool. On the right side, this is the rise of global positioning systems. So you can see this is just taking off exponentially over the last 10 years as well, so that every phone, every vehicle is tracked. Like it or not, that's the reality. And that anonymized data is available for understanding supply chains. And it wasn't just 4 years ago. So we're able to do new things now that no one could ever do before. And then the last of the major new technology categories I want to talk about is the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Basically, even if we were gathering all of this data from remote sensing, from all these GPS coordinates, and from all this satellite imagery every day the way we do, if we didn't have AI and machine learning, we wouldn't be able to make any sense of it or turn it into anything because it's just too much data for the human mind or even a bunch of really smart human minds to process. There's been a huge increase in investment. This is stuff that's happened last 5 years, an increase in investment in artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence as a business has just gone crazy over the last few years. Also, and this is essential for a lot of what we do, artificial intelligence is now better than humans at recognizing images in pictures. Now, AI isn't better at every single human at recognizing every single thing, but on average, AI systems are now better at detecting things in pictures and other kinds of patterns than humans are. And this really took off in the last 5 years after the 2012 invention of deep learning and convolutional neural nets. This was a real breakthrough, a game changer in the ability of computers to recognize objects in pictures. And those are the methods that we use with satellite imagery and massive amounts of location tracking data. We use convolutional neural nets and deep learning in our systems. We couldn't have done that even 5 years ago. So by putting all of this together, we are able to target activity on the ground and identify it remotely and store incredible amounts of data in the cloud and be able to do that affordably as a tiny company and charge shockingly low rates to be able to get the results of that to companies themselves that could never have afforded it even 5 years ago. And so now I'm going to show you how we put all that together to generate valuable results for our clients. The first of our product lines I'm going to talk about is Dirt Work Alert, where we detect well pads and frac ponds using satellite imagery and permit data ahead of permits and rigs. So take a step back for a minute. Why the heck did a company called Sourcewater get into oilfield satellite intelligence? Well, as I mentioned early on, 10 years ago almost, we started by creating the first online marketplace for water and disposal in the oil and gas industry. And that's just not our main business anymore. We've evolved way beyond that, but that's how we got in. And when we were focused on the marketplace business, one of the things we discovered out in Permian, because we were spending a lot of time there, was you'd see these signs by the side of the road, frac water for sale. And when we'd call those people up, we'd get a landowner, a ranch owner, who'd have a frac pit on his or her property, and they would be real excited to sell their water on the internet. And so we thought, well, how do we find all the people that have frac ponds on their property because they love us? So we went to the regulatory data, and what we discovered was there is no data on the locations of frac ponds in Texas. If you are a surface parcel owner and you want to dig a ditch on your land and put some plastic down and put some groundwater in it and sell it to the oil company for fracking, generally speaking, there's some exceptions, but generally speaking, that's your right as a Texan. And so there is no data about an essential step in the completion supply chain or the oil and gas supply chain, which is frac ponds. You always need a frac pond filled up with water before you can run a frac. So how could we find these? Well, we thought maybe we can spot squares of water in the desert from space. And this was, around 2017, and commercial satellite imagery was just becoming available. And so we started building systems to suck in that data pipeline from a bunch of different kinds of satellites and analyze the data. And we used deep learning for that, which was a newly available commercial technology, convolutional neural nets. And what we found was, yes, we are able to very reliably detect frac ponds where no one knew where they were before. And that's actually a key unique type of data that we have in our system today. It turns out that frac ponds are very highly predictive of future completions, which just makes sense, right? You need to build and fill a pond before the frac crew shows up. So this turns out to be a really useful thing to know for a whole bunch of reasons. And by combining that satellite imagery with the artificial intelligence, with land ownership and permit data, we were able to create a new kind of market intelligence around frac ponds that had never existed before. But one of the other things that we realized while we were looking at satellite imagery, exactly like this imagery you're seeing here, is that there was a lot of other stuff happening on the ground in oilfield regions that was either never showing up in regulatory data, like frac ponds, or well pads, or lease roads, or actually flares, all things we're picking up, or the activity was showing up on such a long delay that it wasn't that useful by the time it came out. So for example, spuds and completions, where the frac crews are. So we started building systems to analyze and train the machine to detect all kinds of oilfield activity, to detect things that are either delayed in the permit data or they're just completely missing. And one point I want to make about this, just to make the point that humans can't do this, in our early stages of training our machine learning systems, we had humans marking lots of images to try to pick out what's a frac pond, what's not, pick out what's a well pad, what's some other thing, a warehouse foundation or a harvest being cleared or a road intersection getting built. And first of all, those humans made a lot of mistakes. So, different humans looking at the same photo mark a lot of different things. This is, a big problem, and it gets to part of the heart of building these kinds of systems. But another thing is we'd hired probably 30 GIS and geology grad students from the University of Texas, A&M, and the University of Houston. These are great schools with smart kids who really know what they're doing and know a lot about the subject. But even after they had spent weeks going through these images, basically what we found is if we wanted to analyze the entire Permian Basin every single day for every frac pond and every well pad, we would need 500 trained people working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to do something that we're able to do in about 30 minutes using the power of cloud computing and AI. It's not even possible. So that's an important point as far as the things we're able to do now because of the new technology that we just couldn't have done before. So we started getting our deep learning results, and they were good. Now, they've improved a lot over the years. When we were first doing this, probably only about 1 in 10 well pads that we detected before a permit appears were real well pads. Today, about 9 in 10 that we detect in the Permian are real well pads, even before the permit shows up. Not to say it's perfect, nothing's perfect, but it's simply not even possible to cover that area without using the kinds of systems that we've built and patented. So this became our product, Dirt Work Alert, the idea being to see lease development and future drilling plans ahead of permits, rigs, or your non-source water using competition. And so we were able to map this within our platform, not just the frac ponds, by the way, but all the reserve pits or the mud pits, which are a really important indicator in advance of a rig showing up on the site. Just like frac ponds are a really important early indicator of completions before a frac crew shows up on the site. And then we're able to detect well pads and permits every day and map all of this in the platform. Sometimes the permit comes first, sometimes the well pad comes first, but seeing both together gives you a much better sense of what's happening in the field than only relying on permits or rig tracking. And this got a lot of attention. We were the cover story of the Houston Chronicle a couple of years ago. We were the cover story of the Journal of Petroleum Technology a couple of years ago. Satellites track the Permian. And we got a lot of patents for this. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we've had 13 US patents granted. 10 of those granted patents relate to methods of using satellite imagery and GPS tracking data separately and together to understand oil field and more broadly, energy development. Includes solar, wind, and hydro. The patents cover that too. For understanding energy development on the ground, energy infrastructure, and supply chain activity. So this all sounds great, and you walk around and tell people, hey, what if we could show you who's going to drill where sooner and with more accuracy than permits alone? Sounds great, but before I pay for it, how do I know it really works and you're just not telling me a story? And we realized that no one had ever systematically detected well pads before. So nobody knew anything about how they relate to drilling and permits. Are they useful or not useful? There was absolutely no data out there. So we worked on a big study where we analyzed every single well drilled in the entire Permian Basin in all of 2018 and all of 2019. And we analyzed the time and probability relationship for every single well pad, every single drilling permit, and every single well drilled during that 2-year time period. And you see they track very closely. Here's what we found. We found that the combination of well pads and drilling permits together, and of course, we're not saying you need one or the other, we do both, we provide both, was much more predictive of future drilling activity than only using permits, and in most cases, only using pads. Although in some time periods, well pads were actually more predictive by themselves than even the combination, because permits were throwing things off. So a couple of key takeaways from that study. First of all, for about 1 in 3 wells drilled, the well pad was built in advance of any drilling permit being filed. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not like a violation or anything. It just has more to do with where the contracting crews moving around the basin and who's available where and when. But nonetheless, what that means is that in a lot of cases, seeing the well pads detected before any permit is filed. Now, I want to emphasize there is no other company I'm aware of that detects well pads in advance of any drilling permit. Seeing those pads before a permit does get you ahead of where drilling activity is going a significant portion of the time before the permits. In fact, usually the pad appeared a couple months before the permit in the cases where it was the pad showing up first. Also, though, and this is probably more surprising and more useful in a practical sense, a lot of drilling permits never get drilled, or they don't get drilled for a long time. In Texas, about 1 in 5 didn't get drilled within 18 months after the permit. And in New Mexico, about half didn't get drilled. Now, there's possibly a few reasons for that relating to longer BLM approval times and relating to forced pooling regulations in some states and not in others. But whatever the reason, if you're chasing drilling permits and you're in a business that relies on following where the permits are going, you're going to waste a lot of time and effort if you're chasing drilling permits without also having well pads at the same time. Because the reality is, in Texas at least, you get a permit pretty much the same day you walk into the RC. It costs a couple $100, and it just doesn't mean that much. It's not a big commitment. But when a company builds a well pad, they're spending at least $100,000 to build that pad. In other words, building the pad is a big commitment. And so it turns out in the statistics, when you combine drilling permits with well pads, a permit that gets a well pad is much more likely to get drilled and drilled a lot sooner than a permit that doesn't yet have a pad. Obviously, you can't drill a well without a well pad. It's impossible. It should be impossible to drill without a permit, although we found that in about 7% of cases in New Mexico, actually, the well does seem to be drilled without a drilling permit. I'm sure that's a clerical error, or, a filing error, but nonetheless, physically speaking, you got to have a well pad to drill a well, and it's expensive to build that pad. And so it's a big commitment. And so if you're in a business like mineral investing or like a lot of kinds of oil field services where you're trying to get ahead of the rig and you're chasing permits, it's just a no-brainer to add pads into that analysis. Now let's get to the juicy part. So if you're still with me, thanks for sticking around, because this is what we brought you here for, which is to introduce FracScape, which is a completely new technology for near real-time supply chain activity detection and mapping. And there's 3 big components to it: daily pinpoint frac and rig crew tracking, logistics optimization, and near real-time oil field truck tracking. So one of the things we're able to detect is early indicators such as well pads and frac ponds and rig crew movements ahead of permits and ahead of conventional rig movements, which have helped us see in advance when the market is rising and when it's falling. And I'm going to explain some of the applications for this in our system. But the reason I'm showing you this is it's important for our clients to get ahead of the market and to make sure that they're making good investment decisions, whether the market is going up or going down. And in our core market space, I know we have a lot of people on this webinar today who aren't in oil field water businesses. But as you can guess from our name, Sourcewater, we came from that industry, and that's really the heart of our business today. So we have a lot of water midstream companies, operator water managers, disposal companies, transfer companies, proppant companies that rely on us for understanding what's happening in the oil field water business, particularly produced water. And here's the thing: drilling basically tells you nothing about oil field water related businesses, right? Everything is the frac. It's the completion where all the water gets used, the sand gets used, the chemicals get used, the logistics get used. It's the frac that generates all of the disposal and flow back and pretty much all the completions water that's going to commercial disposal. So our clients really wanted us to be able to do near real-time tracking of the fracs, and the data shows why. Actually, there's kind of a cool video that goes with this. So what you're seeing here is frac pond detections over time in the Permian since the beginning of 2020. And again, we're the only company that tracks frac ponds at all, and we have actually have a patent on that. So what we found is there's an 84% correlation between a frac pond showing up for the first time and a completion happening within the following 30 days. And that makes logical sense because you got to build and fill a pond before you have a frac. But what also is kind of more surprising from the analysis is that when you analyze the other side of the data, commercial disposal volumes, not general injection disposal, but commercial disposal volumes that go on a form type called a P18 in Texas, there's about an 80% correlation between fracs and commercial disposal volumes. So the water market is all about the fracs. And in fact, production volumes don't correlate at all to commercial disposal. Basically, operators send their production water to their own wells, but they send the flowback water to commercial disposers, either in pipelines or trucks. So not only is the water market and the sand market and the disposal market all about the fracs, not the drilling, but actually, as we saw earlier from that IHS study that was sponsored by the EIA, about 2/3 of onshore spending today comes from the fracs or the completions, not from the drilling. And more than 90% of new production today comes from unconventional wells, meaning the fracs, the completions, not the drilling. So we had to find a way to predict and track completions if we wanted to be able to serve our oilfield water market customers. And that turns out to be really useful to just about everybody who's in the upstream business, the operators and the oilfield service companies and the investors of every stripe. So how do we predict completions? Well, all fracs need a pond. We're getting those. They all need proppant. And I'll show you how we're starting to get those. They all need a duct. They all need a drilled but uncompleted well. And they all need a frac crew to show up to frac the well. So let's go duck hunting. Here's the tricky part, right? As I mentioned earlier, if you're trying to track completions using Frac Focus or using the Railroad Commission data, you're going to be anywhere from 5 to 9 months behind the times, right? By then, the duck is gone, the frac happened, and you lost the deal, or you're making an investment without current information. How do we see them either right as they're happening, or maybe even see them before they're happening? That's why we created FracScape. So what you're seeing here, nobody's seen before. On the upper right, you're seeing an image of satellite optical imagery of a well pad. On the upper left, what you're seeing is synthetic aperture radar satellite imagery of that same well pad. And what we've done is we've put together optical imagery, satellite SAR imagery, massive amounts of anonymous mobile GPS tracking data that we're pulling from literally hundreds of millions of people, billions of data points per day, regulatory data showing where all the permits are, and other types of data that we're pulling in literally twice a day for drilling permits. All of this in a variety of machine learning based and rules based artificial intelligence systems, all stored and processed in the cloud to generate daily pinpoint frac crew, rig crew, oil field truck, and duck tracking. And we've had 10 US patents granted all over this with a bunch more pending. So again, coming back to what you're seeing playing on the right side of the screen, let's talk about those dots. Those dots are the cell phones, anonymous cell phones, location points of people who were on that well pad on each of these days shown here. They're actually reported hour by hour with a little bit of a lag, just a couple of days, 1 to 3 days. The optical imagery shows us where the well pad is, and it shows us some aspects of equipment and things like flares and reserve ponds, reserve pits, which tell us the status of well pad. On the left side, the SAR imagery happens to be very good at detecting metal. So we're able to see equipment on the site because of the radar bouncing off the equipment back to the satellite in space. And so what you're seeing here as we kind of scroll over the day-to-day period that we're showing for this particular well pad is red dots are people who are artificial intelligence has been able to associate with rig-related, drilling-related work. The blue dots are people that our system was able to associate with frac or completions-related work. And we're actually getting subcategories of this work too, because we're getting the well cleanout people, we're getting the setup and takedown people, we're getting the water trucks, we're getting all kinds of different job types, even the artificial lift people when they show up. But we're grouping them in a few major categories for the purposes of this analysis. And so what you also see between when the rig crew is there and when the frac crew is there is this yellow colored bar. That yellow colored bar is the duck. It's between when the rig crew leaves and the frac crew shows up, and therefore we know really where the ducks are. And at the top part, we see Permian Basin activities. That's an aggregated blue frac activity levels, red drilling activity levels, and in between the spread, which is the inventory of DUCs broadly. But of course, we're also getting those DUC locations at an extremely pinpoint level. It's not just a market-wide phenomenon. We know exactly who has DUCs, how many they have, where they have them as of 2 to 3 days ago. So one of the ways to look at what we're doing is we're monitoring activity on hundreds of thousands of well pads around the Permian. And when we see a party going on, a whole bunch of people gathering on a well pad that has a drilling permit that hasn't been drilled and fracked yet, we basically zoom in and run the AI on it to see what kind of party is it. Is it a drilling party with a rig, or is it a fracking party with a completions crew there, with a frac spread there? And so that's what you're seeing here is we can zoom in and see what's happening. And you see in the one image, there's a drilling rig and a whole bunch of people around it. And in the other image, you're seeing a frac spread and a whole bunch of people around it. And this has a lot of value in particular for operators, for E&Ps. Why? Well, the top reason that E&Ps have been asking us for this system is to avoid frac hits. And for those who don't know what a frac hit is, it's basically subsurface communication or interference from a hydraulic fracture happening near an existing producing well that can actually destroy or water out that existing well if the existing well has not been properly prepared for the possible frac hit nearby. And so you can wipe out the value of a $10 million well, a bunch of $10 million wells overnight if you don't know that someone on an offset lease is about to do a frac. Now, of course, all operators, most operators, try to maintain good communication with their neighbors to keep track of where their frac crews are and where they're going to be fracking. But the reality is even a very small error, just one missed communication, or maybe somebody who just didn't know to be part of the grapevine, can result in a massive, massive loss. So it makes sense to supplement that human communication, which of course is still necessary, with this type of belt and suspenders approach so that you can see the frac crews near you and avoid those frac hits. But there's a bunch of other reasons that operators have been asking us for this system as well. Another is to save money on crew mobilization, because a huge part of drilling rig and frac crew costs is getting the equipment from the yard over to the site or the DUC. And so if you know where crews are near you, then you're able to call up a crew, whether it's a rig crew or a frac crew, and get them to your site first and save hundreds of thousands of dollars on their demobilization and mobilization again from them going back to the yard and coming back. Another benefit of this system is it shows the private rigs, the ones that don't allow GPS trackers from commercial companies on them. And there's a number of operators that we know own and operate their own rigs and don't let people track them. And we're able to track them. Also, it enables getting ahead of the demand for commodities and services in their local area. So in other words, if you're an operator that can see that a bunch of other operators are about to start fracking in your area, that tells you that you need to get ahead of the sand supply and ahead of the water supply to make sure you've got what you need so that you don't throw away $500,000 a day having a crew sitting on your site without the sand you need or the water you need available matching up with that. And finally, a big value for operators is measuring and benchmarking performance, seeing how long your crews are on site from the real start of setup, not maybe just what they reported, to the real end of work and demobilization. We're able to measure that independently and in near real time so that you know which vendors perform the best for you and which vendors are performing the best for your competitors. Now, another big benefit of the system, of course, is to see well pad activity as it happens, updating daily. And what you're seeing here is a zoom in on a high resolution image of a particular well pad in the upper right, and the optical imagery with the crew on the upper left. And this gets to some of the benefits for oilfield services companies, which are our most frequent clients. One is going duck hunting, right, as I mentioned before, because in the water space and for sand and for disposal and logistics and recycling and a lot of other types of oilfield services, the way to get ahead of the frac crews is not to actually track the frac crews, because by then it's too late, right? The deal was already made. But you need to know which operators have ducks exactly where as of yesterday, because that tells you where the demand is going next. And from that, you're able to predict how much water is going to get used by each of those ducks by combining the knowledge of the duct location, the operator patterns, information that we have about the amount of water they use and produce from each frac, and how much crude oil and gas they produce from new unconventional wells. So knowing where the ducts are gets you ahead of that supply and demand balance so that you're not always behind the ball and behind your competitors. It also enables winning post-frac deals. What I mean is things like well cleanouts and artificial lift, things that happen after the well is completed, which you really can't identify if you're waiting 6 months or 8 months for the completion report to come out of Frac Focus. It also enables companies in the oilfield service business, like pressure pumping companies, to win on logistics because you can offer a much more competitive rate on that oil field or the crew spot market if you can go to an operator who you know has a duct right next door to the duct you're completing right now and offer to them to go to them next before you demobilize. That allows you to beat your competitors on price and on timing if you can see who to pitch next and offer the best, most competitive rate to. Same if you're operating a sand depot, let's say, or you have a water supply nearby or a disposal pipeline nearby. And it allows you to benchmark and ultimately beat your competition, not just in that pricing, but getting to the right deals first and being able to show how you perform compared to your competitors. And then let's talk for a minute about some of the benefits of the system for energy investors and energy analysts. So by seeing the real-time duct inventory company by company and the producing well inventory and the undrilled inventory company by company, lease by lease, region by region, you're able to see ahead of earnings reports exactly where these companies stand, how much they're producing, and how they're performing in managing their operations, both on the operator side and for the oilfield service companies that might be servicing a lot of different operators, that you can track how they're doing and what their market shares are, lease by lease, pad by pad. This also enables modeling and predicting upstream commodity supply and demand, whether you're tracking water and disposal or actually tracking the crude oil itself and the natural gas or natural gas liquids being produced. Now, another area where this kind of intelligence is very helpful is logistics optimization. Consider that the average oilfield worker, when polled, reports being lost on average about 30 minutes per day on lease roads. 30 minutes a day per field worker across the whole industry just thrown in the trash because these dirt roads that connect every single well pad out there that are mostly on private ranches, they are not in Google, they are not in Waze, they are not in Apple Maps. And so how do you efficiently drive from well pad to well pad with good navigational directions? We're able to map all those roads by combining the AI-based identification of things that kind of look like roads, dirt squiggles, in near daily satellite imagery, with location tracking data from the GPS coordinates of the many trucks to be able to create good navigational roads. And we actually have 3 patents on that, so that you can efficiently get between these sites and save a ton of money on the same workers. We're basically able to generate private lease road maps of entire basins that are navigable so that people can get to their jobs quickly and efficiently. And now the very last thing I'm going to show you is really on the cutting edge of development that we're getting ready to put into the product, which is daily mapping of water, sand, crude, and even waste truck routes across the basin. And it's interesting how we got into this. We actually got into this because we wanted to be able to show the real-time waiting times, the standby times at all of the commercial saltwater disposals in the Permian and other regions, so that we could optimize real-time water truck logistics, incorporating not only the distances traveled and the rates being charged, but also the waiting times at the busier wells. Because sometimes it's surprising which ones can have 3-4 hour standby times, whether that's because they've got a really great, free taco brunch, or because they're owned by a particular company that chose to send all their trucks there, or because a whole bunch of people happen to have flow back on the same days at the same times and nobody coordinated. But sometimes you can save 3 hours of waiting time by driving 10 minutes further. So that's how we got into this. But what we found was there was a lot more we could do with it, because not only does this show where the disposal trucks are going, not just in commercial wells, also in places like New Mexico that don't report this regulatory data, and we're able to show it within a few days of it happening, rather than on the 3-month lag that you get from P18 reporting, which we also gather and map. But also we're able to do some other really cool things. So this graphic I'm showing you right now, literally no one has ever seen this before. This has never been shown. What you're looking at here is for one 24-hour period in the Permian Basin, we analyzed the movements of the sand trucks, the proppant trucks, from most of the major sand mines to a bunch of operator frac sites that we discovered by looking at where the sand trucks were going. So you can see there's a bunch of frac sites in the upper left there. We know they're frac sites only because that's where the sand trucks were going. It's not like the operators report these in advance. So what we're seeing is operators who are getting ready to frac by stockpiling that sand before anything is reported. And we're also pretty much able to estimate how much sand they're going to use, and therefore how much oil or gas they're going to produce from that well, and how much water they're going to use, and how much water they're going to produce and dispose of. We're able to see the supply chain relationships between each of these companies. And for the sand companies, we're able to show where they could do better because they have a closer location that should win that business. So there's all kinds of things that come from this. And again, we can do this for the water trucks, for the crude oil going to the midstream terminals, for the solid waste trucks. And we've got patents granted and pending on all this stuff. So there's some really cool things we're able to do with this near real-time supply chain data that no one has ever seen before. So with that, that's the end of our webinar. I hope you stuck it out for the full hour. And let me just recap for a second what we talked about, because I know it's been a bit of a journey. We talked about fracs, ducts, and trucks, how artificial intelligence, satellites, and GPS are disrupting oil field intelligence. I introduced you to our company, Sourcewater, based in Houston, Texas. We talked about what is market intelligence and what kinds of companies use it and why. We talked about problems and opportunities in conventional market intelligence, things like word of mouth, regulatory data, and rig tracking. And we talked about new technology breakthroughs that have enabled new kinds of market intelligence that we're taking advantage of. Then we talked about two products, that one that we've had out for a few months and one that's brand new that no one's ever seen before, Dirt Work Alert, which detects well pads, frac ponds, and reserve pits ahead of permits and rigs, not just waiting for the permits to come out. And our big announcement, which is introducing FracScape, near real-time supply chain activity mapping with daily pinpoint frac and rig crews for logistics optimization, and near real-time oil field truck tracking for sand, water, crude, and other types of activities and crews. And so with that, we're ready for questions. Please feel free to email me, josh@sourcewater.com. Thanks again to Hart Energy for hosting our webinar, and we look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you so much for your time today.